Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am Dr. Julie Ponesse, a member of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. I'm the chair of the Ethics and Law Committee, and I'm absolutely delighted today to sit down with Julius Ruechel. Have I pronounced that right, Julius?
Ruechel. Yeah,
Ruechel, yes,
yeah,
thank you. And I think we're going to have a really interesting, deep, penetrating conversation today because I think one of the things that many of us are realizing as discussions about COVID go along, as the debate becomes more intractable, is that evidence and data are not as persuasive as we might have thought they would be for rational people. And we are seeing battle lines very clearly drawn and very firmly entrenched. And that launching further statistics, further evidence across those lines to the other camp isn't having any kind of effect at all, or very little effect. And we need to start thinking about why that is and what are some of the psychological and the socio-political factors at play that got us to this place. How can we start understanding those better so that we can work our way out of it and back to a more functional kind of democracy, if you want to put it that way, right? So I'm so delighted to be with you today, Julius. I've read a number of your essays. You were an incredibly, I think, bright, intelligent, insightful thinker, and I would love if you could tell people a little bit more about how you came to write about, to think about, and also to write about the COVID issue. I have to tell everybody before you answer that the bio on your website is probably the most compelling, effective, engaging bio I have ever seen. And let me just read a little bit of it to everybody who's watching. So you say, "Who am I? Now that you know my name and have seen my face, the typical thing would be to follow up with a flattering bio. As an academic, I've seen many of these, let me tell you. Instead, I'm going to be cheeky. Rock hammers, cattle, financial markets, and blue jeans have all played pivotal roles in shaping who I am and how I think. But the way they fit together is something I'll leave to your imagination. Perhaps you will imagine me to be a prince among princes or a scoundrel among villains, as somebody, and anybody, or perhaps a nobody at all." So can you tell that's only part of it, but can you tell people a little bit, to the degree that you're comfortable, a little bit
yeah.
more about who you are and how you came to write about the COVID situation?
Yeah, I mean, I really got into this just seeing that the data and the reality were no longer matching and started writing about it to, initially to try to communicate my ideas to family and friends and just to kind of build a framework to house this massively complex pile of nonsense, right? But as did more of that and kept running into a wall with friends and family, I've started posting it more on Twitter and started writing from there and put the website up. And then it just kind of grew from there, just trying to grapple with this madness that is so divorced from any kind of reality, right? So that's kind of how I dove into the middle of it. And part of it was also just, I think, through family stories from the Second World War and more importantly the time period leading up to it, that I recognized fairly quickly, once I realized that it was not the panic that we needed, that there was a serious threat to our liberties. And I mean, the moment that they started talking about mandatory masks and border closures and all that, I realized, okay, this is fundamentally rattling the core of how our society functions.
I've taken it from, reading a number of your papers that you see some parallels between our
Yeah.
situation now and probably 1930s, 1940s Europe,
Yeah.
and we should get to that and talk about that in a minute. But
Yes.
before we get there, I just want to pick up on another thing you say in your bio, which is that in the end, it doesn't matter who I am, what credentials I bring to the table, and in some sense, the less that someone knows about you, or knows about me, as an academic, the less reason you'll have to trust me, and therefore the more you will take what I'm saying at face value, or, and maybe do your research and then figure out for yourself if it's credible or not. And I think that's a really interesting claim at this time, when we treat words like science and expert as synonyms for perfection. And we idolize those concepts. I'm not sure we know what they mean, but we idolize them nonetheless. And if you're on the side of science and the experts, you are not only on the intellect on the right side intellectually, but you are virtuous, you are morally good, you are a good citizen, you're a good democratic participant. And if you are not on the side of whoever has deemed to be the scientists and the experts, then not only are you wrong, but you're shut down and you're excluded and your voice no longer matters, right? So do you want to elaborate on that? Is that a fair characterization of some of the things you're thinking?
Very much so. I mean, I think watching academia, even in the like in the few years now before COVID even came along,
Mhm.
there's, as you say, there's this belief in the expert, and yet the very core principle of what makes science function is debate. It's free speech. It's not credentials. It's not consensus. It's evidence-based debate. It's a actual battle of ideas that are probing each other for weaknesses, but based on good faith understanding of the other person's position, not with an intention to win the debate. It's to bring truth to the surface. And I think that the cancel culture that is completely overwhelmed uh, academia is essentially a big part of why we're in this mess right now, is that there's no immunity or defense system against any idiotic idea that comes along.
One thing that's quite noticeable to me is the complete absence of any reference within medicine to the term evidence-based medicine anymore, and I think that's
Yeah.
convenient, right? That has been the driving concept behind the practice of medicine for decades now, right? The idea that looking at the evidence, the available data, the highest quality available data, and looking at it through your own critical lens, presumably, is very valuable when it comes to making diagnoses and avoiding error and making prognoses and things like that. And very conveniently, I think that concept of evidence-based medicine has slipped out of not only medicine, but scientific debate and public discourse because there's some desire not to look at the evidence anymore because that would undermine some of the political goals at play, right?
There's such a strong, political bent to how funding is distributed now, that like in the academic fields, that if you speak out in the wrong direction on something, your career is probably toast. And so I think that the core principles that are meant to be taught alongside the actual scientific field that you're studying have essentially been ignored, and are in some ways not even being taught in the remotest way, to make people understand that you know wearing the lab coat and knowing how to take the right measurements doesn't actually make you a scientist. That makes you a technician, and what makes the technician a scientist is the next part, which is to put your ideas out there and ferociously debate it with those that are looking in good faith where the weaknesses are in the ideas that you come up with. So the measurements are only the first step in that scientific process, and yet we've conveniently sort of sidelined the rest of it, because that's actually extremely hard, and hard on your ego when you lose a debate, and like it's very inconvenient to engage in that. But I
I'm
think,
also sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that this is where, if you look at sort of the history of science, the way it evolved, like that's there's a process that came out of the Enlightenment, where you kind of created this bubble of free speech that then produces good, a mechanism to arrive at truth, because of being able to work inside this free speech bubble, and that bubble has essentially disappeared.
I wonder sometimes, trying to think charitably, what it is that, say, the majority of Canadians think about science, how they think science works. And when you listen to the public messaging, or when you listen to, what's going on in public discourse about the nature of science, you kind of get the impression that it's this perfect closed system that is actually devoid of experimentation, because experimentation involves, as I think you're gesturing towards, this idea that it involves this potential for, there's a risk element, right? There's a potential
Yes.
for failure, a potential for exposure, a potential to realize that the work that you've spent your time and effort on for the last 3 months, the last 3 years was actually wrong. You need to take a new direction. But inherent to the scientific method is this idea that you make an initial hypothesis, which is a guess of sorts, at your best guess, an educated guess, but a guess, and you try it out. And not all attempts to validate that hypothesis will be successful, and that's exactly how it should be.
I mean, if you look at how science, like the history of science, scientists get it wrong all the time. That's in fact the default position you need to take on anybody saying anything. What makes science unique is that there's a self-corrective mechanism built into the process, which starts with debate and free speech, that is able to root out those ideas when you get it wrong. And if that system isn't functioning anymore, then you have no more self-corrective mechanism, right? But I think the issue is that right from day one, like from your very first science class, you have a teacher standing at the front of the room, Ministry of Truth, telling you what knowledge has been arrived at through the scientific process. And so it gives this impression of this infallible group of people that as long as you have the right credentials, you have access to truth that nobody else has. And all through university, even, it's very much that same illusion. And then, COVID comes along or any of these other hot topics, and you have some expert that's hauled out by the media and or by the government that stands on a podium and tells you what the truth is. What needs to happen is that the debate that should be happening should be front and center for people to see, so that you actually realize that there's multiple ideas and a weighing process that has to happen in policymakers' eyes, because there's multiple opinions on many different things, and those opinions have to go through the gauntlet of debate to arrive at objective truth.
And as an ethicist, we're very concerned about informed consent.
Yeah.
And when you close off the reality and you give people the impression that these issues are settled, that that there are no effective treatments for COVID, for example, that the vaccines are perfectly safe, they're effective, they reduce transmission, all of these things. When you present those pieces of information as facts to people, it undermines their ability to weigh options and make risk benefit analyses for themselves, which is foundational to the idea of informed consent, which is a deeply entrenched Canadian right. So that seems to me to be why, in some sense, this scientific problem, which, if people are listening over the last 5 minutes of our conversation, they think, well, that sounds very abstract. What is this business about science? Why does it matter? Well, it's to me, it seems like it matters deeply because uh, how transparent science is and how transparent medicine is ends up deeply affecting a
Mhm.
person's ability to make choices about his or her own body and the kind of lives we want to lead and what democracy looks like and things like that, right? So this is very important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the historical situation that happened in the 1930s in Germany. The eugenics ideas were global prior to Germany taking them to the extreme. I mean, they actually came out of America, this idea that you could, through sort of a Darwinian selective process, produce a healthier society. We started with a health idea. But what made that idea so incredibly deadly, I think, in some respects in Germany, was 1933, when they started banning the book or burning the books. Because at that point, you create this echo chamber where an idiotic idea can no longer be rooted out, because the alternative to that idea is now politically incorrect and you can't hear it. And so it creates this like escalating dynamic for hysteria to just wind itself up to unlimited ends. And that's where it then produces, like, so that, the book burning in 1933 ultimately leads to Kristallnacht in 1938 and to the gas chambers in the 1940s, because of that self-corrective mechanism being gone. And then a society just embraces a wild idea and just continues to run with it. And anyone that says no is arrested or silenced in some ways. And I mean, right now, when you look at a YouTube channel being canceled, we're on the same path, in that we don't know where this is going to end, how far the hysteria goes. But if your and my voices can't push back against Dr. Tam's, how far does the hysteria wind itself up?
I was going to ask you, before you made that connection to YouTube, do you think we're burning books now?
Very much so. I mean,
Mhm.
the delete button achieves the exact same thing, because it's not the paper itself that matters, it's the idea that you're trying to put out there. this idea that, oh, you have to silence false information. No, you need to debate it. If you think I'm wrong, call me on it so that we can actually talk about it.
Yeah.
Hold me to task on it, because the YouTube channel, the Twitter channel that puts out a different idea, if that idea is wrong, it's so easy to tear it apart. But by burning it, by banning it, it's the same thing. It prevents you from hearing an alternative interpretation or somebody pointing out to a piece of data that isn't convenient for the government narrative.
Let's talk about the term misinformation for a minute, should we?
Yeah.
Um, I was reading about Copernicus and Galileo the other day.
Yes.
Crazy idea. Stuff revolves around the sun.
Yeah.
um, do you see parallels between how and I'm going to choose my language carefully here. I was going to say sort of dissenting scientists, and I think it might be more appropriate to say the scientists and the physicians and others who are labeled misinformers, right? Let's use that language of labeling them so that we're not
Yeah.
making a claim about whether they are, right? So
Yeah.
people who are labeled misinformers. Do you see analogies between those people and how people like scapegoats, witches, Copernicus, Galileo have been treated in the past. Is there an apt analogy there? Am I crazy to think that to draw a parallel?
No, I think it's actually quite accurate. I mean, the history of science starts actually with the Catholic Church um, trying to understand the universe through a religious, lens. It was, Aristotle and Plato's philosophy combined with biblical texts. But as and part of it is the technology allowing you to look at the stars through a telescope started bringing more data in, so that, I mean, that's where you see theology and science kind of split ways. That one was more of a philosophical approach to life, the other one was evidence-based, looking at the world to see what kind of conclusions you can draw from it, so that they don't actually cover the same field anymore. But what that did was, of course, challenge the church's um, hold on truth, right? Like they were essentially functioning as the ministry of truth. And so when these folks like Galileo come in and say, well, here's the evidence of something else, just like today, it was cancel culture. And in that time, it was, the church and state that did it. Now the mob is doing it. But if the laws that are being pushed by our government are being put in, like this bill C-36, we're back to full-on ministry of truth, government controlled
Let's pause there, Julie.
truth.
Can
Yeah.
you say a bit more about what you mean by a ministry of truth and whether you think we have one now and who that might be or what that might be? I have
Yeah, I
some
mean,
guesses, but I'm going to let you say.
well, I mean, I think the ministry of truth comes from, for anyone that hasn't read George Orwell, it comes from this idea that the government has literally a ministry of truth that decides what's real and what's correct. And then, I mean, the parallels I think that he was also referring to was things like the Soviet Union, which literally functioned that way. And I think that we are very much on that same path. I mean, when Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand's prime minister, stands on the podium and says, the only source of information you need to listen to is us, like, the government websites, we know what's up, and the rest, like everything else, just assume that it's wrong and just come and look at our stuff. That is a full-on ministry of truth. We're already there.
Mhm.
And they're just now basically slowly testing the legal structures to make it official. I mean, the Biden administration has already admitted openly that they're telling the big tech media companies who to censor and what things should be removed as misinformation.
Mhm.
We're there. This isn't a risk anymore. It's already here.
And my understanding is that we've actually been, investigating how to make this ministry of truth more effective for
Yes.
the last number of years. So maybe you'll remember this Sustein's book on nudge units, right? And he's been
I've
working
heard
with
of them.
the World
Yes.
Health Organization, and now the Canadian government, has a nudge unit of sorts. It's the Behavioral Insights Unit, run through the Privy Council, unless I'm mistaken about that. But the idea there is that there's a sort of back and forth between the information that is directed at the public and then the information that comes from the public back to the government so that they can gear their responses appropriately, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that I guess one question is, what kind of effect do you think the presence of something like that, a nudge unit, has in society? That's one question. Then another question is, do you think that that is appropriate for a democracy? Um,
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's an absolutely horrible thing because it's essentially changed the nature or the role that government plays in our lives. Like in a liberal democracy, government's main role is to act as defender of individual rights and not to act as a shepherd that manipulates society towards certain outcomes.
mhm.
And that's essentially what a nudge unit is doing, is it's treating us like a bunch of cattle that are being shuffled around in whatever direction the shepherd wants for us to, achieve the shepherd's idea of an ideal utopia. It's incredibly dangerous, and but it's ultimately what society seems to be okay with. And I think that's the biggest betrayal for me, is that the
Yeah.
average person that is a part of this hysteria actually sees this as okay to trample rights and silence other people in order to achieve an outcome. And that's where, to me, I think, is the core essence of this entire catastrophe, is that society is no longer holding, or government, to the expectations of defending individuals before social engineering goals.
This is I agree with you. This is the thing that scares me the most. I think that we have, I mean, since my lifetime as someone born in the 70s, there have been moments when government actions have really terrified me, but I have never seen the popular opinion align with them and maybe even push for them as strongly as we're seeing now. I think that charitably, what someone might say to that is, well, hold on a minute here. Rights are all well and good when things are functioning well and when we have the luxury to have them, but we're in a crisis here, right? And we need to think about the greater good. And so we all need to make sacrifices and we need to put limitations on those rights in order to prevent something terrible from happening, all of us getting sick, all of us dying, right? Um, there is another notion. We were talking about, words that have evidence-based medicine has disappeared now. It seems to me another word that has disappeared is the notion of inalienable.
Well, I
Right?
think that the point that you make about, well, rights are all well and good, but there's a crisis going on.
We
Like
don't have
it,
the luxury to
yeah,
think about rights.
like the right is actually precisely what you need in a crisis, so that you don't empower a small group of elites to decide for everyone else how to balance the risks and priorities in their life. So that, like in the idea of a liberal democracy, you have the right to protect yourself and do anything you want to protect yourself, but you don't have the right to control somebody else, right? Because they also have the right to protect themselves and figure out how to balance all the risks in their life. The reality is COVID is only one risk among thousands in everyone's life. I mean, if you've got, your children are not going to be fed if you don't have a job. A virus that has essentially a 99.9% survival rate is pretty irrelevant compared to starving to death. So that's the idea that grew out of the Second World War through the Nuremberg codes and the United Nations Declaration of Universal Rights, is that the individual's rights at all costs have to be protected, especially during a crisis, not except when there's a crisis.
Exactly. That makes yes, and there's an irony here too in thinking, as a student of the history of philosophy, and we look at, a British philosopher like Thomas Hobbes, and he explains that humans form society because we wanted to get out of the state of nature where we felt very vulnerable from we didn't want people to just be able to steal from us and kill us whenever they wanted to. So we thought, well, we'll put some limitations on our freedoms in order to protect ourselves a little bit more. And now we're finding ourselves, victimized by the very people that we're supposed to be, getting support from, and that rights are supposed to be protected within that, as you say, a kind of liberal democracy. I want to bring you to a couple of your articles, which are so interesting. The first article of yours I read was the one on number crunching, and I forget the name of that one, but you, I think, did a really exceptional and insightful job of putting into context a lot of the numbers and the ratios and the percentages we're hearing that are driving a lot of the fear.
Oh, that's the big report, the lies exposed by the numbers?
That's it. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the second one I read was called The Emperor Has No Clothes,
Yes.
Finding the Courage to Break the Spell. And that's the one I really want to talk about today, because there I think you're really excavating some of the psychological causes of our behavior now, and also how to address some of those. So could you tell everybody, I mean, other people like me might not have read that story since they were 8 or 12 or something.
Yes.
So could you remind everybody what the Emperor Without His Clothes story is about, and then we can get into it a little bit.
Yeah, it's Hans Christian Andersen's 1837 fairy tale. And I mean, he talks about these charlatans, these tailors that come into town that are actually not tailors, right? They are pretending to be able to make the finest clothes in the world and convince this emperor that they can produce these amazing robes that are, finer than anything else. And so they go through all the motions, and yet there's actually nothing on the loom when they're weaving. But they tell the king that these are such fine threads that only somebody that is like only like a really like uneducated idiot would not be able to recognize how fine these threads are. So everybody shuts up so that they don't get this label of being the idiot that can't see what's supposedly so obvious. And so they build this entire idea up about these amazing robes, and then there's a great big parade to roll out these new robes. And everybody, of course, is now also afraid to point this out to the king for fear of losing their head or their career, right? Sound familiar? And then, of course, as the parade goes by, there's a kid hanging out with his parents, and he looks at the emperor as he's going by, and then laughs and points and says, "Why is the emperor not wearing any clothes?" And that's the spark that breaks the entire illusion, because somebody had
Like they had to break the glass, right? They
yeah.
had to. Yes, I can almost imagine. And now the analog would be people whispering and saying, "Do you are you noticing that some of this data doesn't make sense? Shh, 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 shh.
Yeah,
Never
yeah,
mind." Right? Um, in that story, it took a child.
yeah. And it's the child that doesn't have all these, hang-ups of an adult of what is somebody going to say, or am I going to be judged, or is somebody going to mock me? They just say it like they see it. And once the first voice starts, then ideally it continues to grow from there. And I think that's the core of this article, is to say, listen, you have to say it. You have to break this illusion that makes it safe for other people to say it as well. That's the only way to do this, is that all of us have to get out in front of our friends and family and actually let them know that we're not okay with this. Doing it on Twitter is irrelevant because it's not reaching the eyeballs that need to see it. It has to be sort of, look in somebody's eyes and say, this is rubbish.
Why are we so afraid, do you think? Is it shame? Are we terrified of being shamed?
I think it depends on different parts of society. The shame is part of it, but I mean, in the academic world, your career is probably on the line if you say something, and so you're choosing between doing what's correct and your mortgage and your ability to feed your family,
There
and that.
certainly there certainly are, I think, those kind of concrete worries people feel, but I feel like even if those things were not a risk, people still would be not inclined to speak out, because there's something else that's deeper, that's more personal, that's more vulnerable. Um,
I mean, I think the other part of it is something that Martin Luther King recognized in the civil rights movement, is that there is safety in numbers. And so if you speak out and nobody stands next to you, you're going to face all the consequences all on your own.
mhm.
Whereas if you speak out and there's a bunch of other folks that stand next to you, it pulls more people in. And what we're seeing now, I mean, academia has been experiencing this now for decades, where if you speak out, nobody else will stand next to you because you don't want to be labeled as some kind of extremist nut job that has lost their grasp on reality. And
Yeah.
so you're left standing alone, and that lesson is taught to every single person that watches it. It's sort of like the story of, like, children that have grown up in an abusive household. Yes, the dad or the mom, whoever is the violent one, the blows sting, but the other parent that says nothing is teaching a much more important lesson, which is that it's okay and that nobody's going to come to your aid. And that's what's happened, I think, to a large degree, is that people recognize that if they speak out, they're going to be on their own. Nobody's going to stand up for them.
Mhm.
And so what Martin Luther King's recognition is that you have to stand up at all costs, no matter how bad it gets, in order to be able to give other people the courage that they're not going to stand alone if they join you, that you're not going to flinch and pull back as soon as the first, bully club hits you.
It's very interesting, this idea of, having the courage to stand out. I've talked to a lot of students and university students and parents of university students, and very often they will say that, oh, I can't have that kind of courage because I'm too afraid.
Yeah.
And interesting, my area of specialty is Aristotle and his ethics,
Yes.
and he writes a lot about courage, but never says that it's in the absence of fear.
No, that's right.
Right? You can be a courageous person while being terribly afraid. It's just that you have enough confidence in what you're doing that you're able to push through that fear or push that fear aside. And so there's a kind of a simultaneous managing of, speaking out and pushing ahead if you believe it's the right thing, while also comfortably holding that fear in its reasonable place.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's important for people to have a discussion about this or to think about this, that the mere fact that you feel afraid doesn't mean you aren't brave, and it doesn't mean
Yeah.
you can't be brave, right?
Yeah.
That speaking out probably will come with a great deal of fear, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean it's not good. It doesn't mean that you're not on the right path or something, right?
Well, and I think that I think the other part too is that people go, well, I don't know that much about this, virology, so I really shouldn't have an opinion about this. And that's incorrect, because the issue is not whether or not you know better than Dr. Tam about how virology works. The issue is you should be calling out the fact that why is Dr. Tam not willing to debate somebody that has a different opinion? And at that point, you're actually calling for a completely different thing. You're not calling for an outcome. You're calling for a process to be reestablished. And that without that process, you have no science, you have no democracy. And that's, I think, the easier call to make. But in this, avalanche of do masks work and is the vaccine correct, that actual core issue is being lost. And that's the one that people need to grab a hold of, that makes it easier to speak out. It doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong on any of the details. What matters is somebody should be willing to stand up and debate me and have the courage to talk sense into me if I'm wrong, or have the humbleness to have their own ideas also tested by me when I debate them.
The fact that I can't remember how many months ago now it was, but the fact that the Ford government and his COVID response team was challenged to a debate, and it has, as far as I know, gone without response. That should be very worrisome to people, I think. And as you say, you may not know about the science, you may not know about the immunology, but you probably have an intuition about how democracy is supposed to work. And that kind of lack of transparency, lack of willing to come to the podium, lack of willing to engage with the people and answer their questions, that should be setting off alarm bells all over the place,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the Great Barrington Declaration, it's this document that essentially said we should be doing focus protection and letting the rest of society go about their lives. But all the science that's in there is directly reflecting the 2019 WHO pandemic planning guidelines. That was, consensus science. And so when this document was released, you didn't see, no matter how many calls there were for some kind of debate, you didn't see any of our public health officials willing to actually engage in that debate. Instead, they wrote these smear-laden takedown articles that the media pushes in front of everybody without giving any kind of ability for the folks that wrote it to respond to these smears. So that's not debate. Like a one-sided platform given to one side of the debate with the media cheering that on is just not actual science. And I think that's where the public needs to say, listen, there's got to be real debate, otherwise you have lost your legitimacy as to govern our lives.
The position that we're in now, where 80 some percent of the population has gotten vaccinated, and we've just seen, so are we in the second week of August now? And depending on, when people watch this, it's good to give them a sense of where we're at. And we are just starting to see, I think, a floodgate of vaccine mandates opening up.
Yeah.
The impression I have that most people are feeling is that 80% the population that's following the orders, wearing masks and following lockdown orders and getting vaccinated, that those are the people with freedom, and that the people who are resisting are the people whose freedoms are going to be limited. But at the beginning of your paper on the emperor, does not in fact have his clothes.
Yeah.
You say the government, and this is a direct quotation, will grant temporary conditional privileges tied to virus seasonality, good behavior, or whatever other conditions they choose to set to achieve the engineering agenda of the day. End quote. And we have this idea that we're a stratified society. We are a stratified society, but into the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and those who will follow and those who will resist the public measures. But we have this idea that those who follow them are the ones who hold all the cards, that they're the ones who will be protected by the government. Is that true?
No, I mean, if your freedom is conditional, that's not freedom, because that means that what you have is a privilege that can be granted or taken away by somebody with power over your life. That's not a free society. That is an authoritarian tyranny. The irony that a lot of people miss is that a tyranny is not actually tyrannical towards every single citizen. A tyranny is only because a tyranny requires a certain percentage of the population to be benefiting from it in order to maintain the public support to continue to exist. So tyranny is always a question of one group benefits while the other group is under the boot heel and is being harmed by it. The thing that people forget is that that equation shifts. Put a different king is born, a different prime minister is elected, and all of a sudden everything shifts, and you are the one that's underneath the boot heel and not the one that's sitting on the pile of gold. So yeah,
I remember reading. So recently, there was an article in the Globe and Mail, and they were showing that the majority of Canadians are claiming the majority of Canadians support barring the unvaccinated from public gatherings, which I is probably true, the majority. But I remember reading something interesting about how in 1940s Germany, that many of the German people, upon hearing of the horrors in the concentration camps, that didn't make them think, oh my goodness, this is an injustice, so we better do something about this. In fact, the effect was sort of the opposite, that they just became more scared, more afraid that they might also be in that situation. But then they fell more in line with the Nazi orders. So, fear is has a very interesting effect on our logic, right? And
well, that's the thing, is that these sorts of tyrannies don't appear in full, force on day one. It's a little tiny slices that get you there. And if you don't speak out soon enough, you reach the point where you're afraid to speak out because the consequences are so huge. I mean, there's a story from my dad's side of the family. My grandma, during the Second World War, she managed to find some red tinsel paper, and so she made a little red stars to hang on the Christmas tree. And my grandpa came back, like he was on leave from the war. This is in Germany. And he saw these red stars and just tore them off the Christmas tree. And she was really shocked. And he says, if anybody sees a red star on our Christmas tree, they're going to think that we're Soviet sympathizers and they'll shoot us. We'll be dead by morning, right? So at that point, you realize that it doesn't matter anymore what the regime is doing that's out of line. You just the act of speaking out puts you in the same in front of the same pistol, right?
There's so much to unpack there. I think the idea of symbols and symbolism
Yeah.
is really interesting. We think about the sort of the symbols that were attached to Jews in the 30s and 40s, and the Star of David and the arm tattoos and the serial numbers on the prison uniforms, and uh, thinking about whether or not there are legitimate parallels between that kind of identification and symbolization then and what it led to, and things like vaccine passports and QR codes and vaccine cards and mask wearing and those as symbols of you belonging to a unique group of persons that distinguishes you from other persons within supposedly the same state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that a lot of society functions on symbolism, because to function in evidence-based conversations about everything becomes too overwhelming. So we take that shortcut and use
Ah,
symbols to manage to, cope with some kind of a meaningful representation of what life might be like in order to be able to function, right?
So symbols are almost a shorthand.
Yes.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So when we see that someone has their vaccine passport with them, it isn't just a piece of paper with some numbers and dates written on it.
No.
It is part of a much larger discussion and the culmination of I'm not going even to say consent, obliging to follow
Yeah.
a certain narrative, and it's a symbol of what's important to someone and what isn't important to someone. It's very laden, right? It's a symbol of
It's
what we have allowed our governments to
yeah.
do to us.
Well, yeah, it essentially symbolizes that you accept the dominant political philosophy that is now governing our society, that you're obedient or compliant to some degree. But it's also that it symbolizes that you're a good person, because in this idea of this misdirected empathy that we've got going on right now, you are a good person if you do these things. It shows that you care about other people and you want to save lives. And if you don't have it, then you are not a good person because you don't care about other people. And so that symbol is essentially preventing you from even thinking yourself through the nuanced details, because it's so compelling and simple. It's a simple narrative.
Is there, I'm going to ask you one last question here. Is there a limit to that, do you think, for most people? I grant your point that there is a desire to either to be good or to have the appearance of being good. And I'm not sure which of those is a greater motivator right now, but
Yeah.
let's leave that, that question aside. But is there a limit to what people do either to be good or to have the appearance of being good or virtuous or a good citizen, do you think?
I mean, this is where you start getting into some of these crazy psychology experiments. Like I think the Milgram experiment, where the researcher was sitting in the room with a test subject, and through the glass window is a person that's hooked up to a bunch of electrodes. And then the researcher would tell the guy, well, hit that button. And then every time he hits the button, the person on the other side of the window, who's actually an actor, pretends that he's getting an electric shock, and then the researcher keeps turning up that dial, and there's a some percentage of the population allows it to go to a full 10. The guy is screaming and then falls to the floor, and he doesn't even know if the guy is dead, right? So there's a certain degree or a certain percentage of people that are willing to go along with this idea of obeying the rules,
Without
being
limit.
obedient, and there's no limit to that. Not all of society, but a good portion of it. So yeah, there isn't necessarily a limit to how far you're willing to go to be seen as a good person. Like if society views obedience as a moral thing to do, where does it end? There is no end.
And so the thought then would seem to be that we need to shift our values away from obedience to something else that's more important and more democratic.
Yeah.
There is an idea, don't you think, that what it is to be a good democratic citizen is to be an obedient one? I think I'm not sure where that came from, but I think there is that idea in the sort of the popular mind right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing to obey laws that are moral or that are reasonable, but it's not like that's where I think the individual has to have their own uh, weighing system in their mind to say, well, if a law it becomes immoral, it's actually immoral to obey that law. And that if the laws are being produced without the checks and balances of a proper democracy, then those laws are actually by definition not a moral law.
We need to think it's not just our right to make choices in a democracy or as Canadians, but we have a responsibility to make sure that the laws we're following are good ones
Yeah.
and that the people that are implementing them and enforcing them are doing so correctly and judiciously and with the rule of law and
Yeah.
in the way that the Constitution directs.
I mean, even the police, that when they enforce a law, they can be held accountable, like legally accountable, criminally accountable, if they enforce a law that's illegal. So, I mean, all of these mask mandates and all these things that have not passed the Section 1 charter challenge are all illegal, and every single police officer, every single doctor, anybody that's enforcing any of these mandates and pushing something on somebody is potentially legally accountable once this hysteria ends.
I think in the coming weeks and months, we're going to start seeing these legal challenges emerge from the shadows in some sense. And it will be very interesting to see how it gets worked out in the courts and how judges respond.
I'm nervous about it because I think that I mean, we've seen now for a year and a half that the courts systematically avoid dealing with this. They are completely captured by the regime. And then the only way that that shifts is once the courts sense that there's a public mood shift that desires proper justice, again, according to what liberal democracy sees as justice, then the courts will shift again, but not until then. So if the hysteria continues, the courts are absolutely useless. So it really boils down to what you and I say in public. And by you and I mean like all of our
Everybody.
viewers, everybody, every citizen has to start saying we need our democracy back. Otherwise, there's no limit.
Which is
And
why it's so important to sit down and talk openly about these ideas, ideas that are never going to see the, the light of day
yeah,
in mainstream media, not the way things are going anyway. But it's so important that we try to, find a sort of a crack in the narrative and pry it open,
yeah,
so that people have more ideas to think on, so that there's a greater opportunity to engage more people and weave a greater sort of a more complex, a more nuanced story about what's going on, how we got here, and where we can go now. And Julius, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll finish up for today. And I'm going to make you promise before you leave that we can continue our discussion another day.
yes, definitely. I'd love to come back.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye bye.